the assassination to Charlie Kirk, was this huge seismic moment, right?
Yeah.
Sent shockwaves everywhere.
Absolutely, a major national event.
But the story, it didn't end there. What happened after? That's where things get really complicated.
You've got the congressional testimony he refused to give, these radical political campaigns popping up after his death.
It's just packed with these unsettling ambiguities, these deep political cracks showing.
Exactly.
So we're going beyond the headlines today. We want to give you that complete, nuanced understanding. This is The Deep Dive, powered by the KaiZen mindset.
And here's the real knot we need to untangle today, because the sources, they really pull in different directions.
Okay.
Was that massive political response to Kirk's death? Was it genuine collective grief? Or was it something more coordinated, a strategic push to permanently change the rules of political debate in America?
Yeah, because we've got sources suggesting both, don't we?
Yeah.
It looks like this really sophisticated mix of, well, actual mourning and some pretty intense political maneuvering.
It really does.
We're going to lay out those contradictions for you. And definitely stick around until the very end.
Yeah, you want to hear this.
We've got a final thought on how this whole tragedy basically redefined cancel culture in America and why that matters. Like fundamentally to you, the citizen, the voter, the person just trying to figure out what's going on. Our mission here is to pull out those core conflicts, the arguments that were debated most fiercely. We're talking everything from those murky details about his potential involvement in January 6th.
Right, the financial stuff.
All the way to that clash after his death between, faith and just raw fury. Let's jump in. Okay, so let's start by setting the stage. Before the shooting, what kind of influence did Charlie Kirk actually have? Because we're not talking about some minor commentator here.
Oh, not at all. Not even close. The sources, like the New York Times, they describe him as this incredibly influential figure. And yeah, deeply polarizing, too.
What they call the hard right movement.
Exactly. He wasn't just, talking at people. He was activating them. The Times actually called him something of a kingmaker.
A kingmaker? How so?
Well, he could apparently leverage this huge youth following he'd built up. He could rally support to protect certain cabinet nominees, for example. Or on the flip side, he could target Republicans he thought weren't loyal enough to the Trump agenda.
So real political muscle.
Definitely. Axios even called him a driving force in Donald Trump's presidential campaigns. He was really central to building that institutional base for populist conservative youth politics.
And his public style, his brand. The sources talk about cultural combativeness. That was key, wasn't it?
Absolutely key. It feels like it was a very calculated strategy. His organization, Turning Point USA, it grew incredibly fast precisely because he embraced this sort of unapologetic, confrontational style.
It got attention.
It got massive attention, high visibility, rapid growth. But, the flip side is it really deepened those social and political divides, which arguably might have been the whole point.
And the sources mention specific kinds of comments.
Oh, yeah. He was known worldwide for making comments described as incendiary and often racist and sexist. That stuff grew constant media attention, sure, but it also really energized his base.
We probably need some concrete examples here just to understand the climate he operated in and maybe how it connects to the later talk about political violence.
Yeah, good idea. The sources give a few pretty stark ones. For instance, Kirk publicly called George Floyd a scumbag.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. George Floyd, the black man whose murder by police, sparked worldwide protests. Kirk's comment was part of this broader aggressive attack on the Black Lives Matter movement, especially on college campuses. It was designed to provoke, to draw a line.
Highly charged rhetoric.
Extremely. But maybe the most jarring statement, especially considering how he died, was about the Second Amendment.
Right. I remember reading about this.
Yeah.
It speaks volumes about his core philosophy, doesn't it? Let's unpack that.
Okay, so this was April 2023. He's at a Turning Point USA event in Salt Lake City, Utah, which is, ironically, not that far from the university where he was eventually killed.
Yeah.
And he's arguing really passionately against any restrictions on gun ownership. He's framing gun rights as the, ultimate guarantor of liberty. And then he says this, and it's a direct quote from the record. I think it's worth it. I think it's worth to have a cost of, unfortunately, some gun deaths every single year so that we can have the Second Amendment to protect our other God-given rights.
He explicitly said the cost was worth it. Human lives as a necessary cost for that freedom.
He explicitly accepted that premise. Political freedom, secured by the Second Amendment, required accepting a cost in human lives. which, as you said, creates this profound, almost unbelievable irony when his own death was later used to justify clamping down on political speech.
It really sets the stage for all the contradictions in his legacy.
Yeah.
But even before the assassination, there was this other huge cloud hanging over him, right? The January 6th testimony.
Yes. This is where it gets really complex, shifting from rhetoric to financial records and legal moves. Kirk was subpoenaed. He had to appear before the Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack.
And the testimony, it revealed this real standoff, didn't it? Especially about money and his organization, Turning Point Action, or TPA.
Exactly. TPA. The committee was zeroed in on finding out how involved TPA really was in getting people to D.C. for those protests right before the Capitol breach.
What evidence did they have?
Well, they presented some key communications. There was this text exchange December 26th, so just a few days before Jan 6. A TPA staff member, Caroline Wren, texts Kirk. She says she's meeting a donor who's ready to invest in bringing people out to D.C. for the January 6th protests.
Okay, so that sounds like active fundraising, planning for the event.
It certainly looks that way, but Kirk's immediate written response, it was striking.
What did he say?
He texted back, quote, "Nothing for Jan 6th, can call soon."
Nothing for Jan 6th. That seems pretty clear. A direct denial of TPA involvement for that specific date.
Right, a seemingly definitive statement. But then the committee presented more evidence that has completely undercut that denial, or at least made it look very, very questionable.
What was that?
It was an email thread. This one was from Thursday, December 31st. So 5 days after he texted nothing for Jan 6.
Okay.
In this email thread, Caroline Wren writes to an event planner, Justin Caparel. She asks him, quote, "Please send Charlie the invoice and expense breakdown for the $211,931.33 payment needed for the January 6th build-out. The invoice should be made to Turning Point Action."
Whoa, wait. $211,931.33. That's incredibly specific. Over $200,000.
Exactly. Not a round number, not an estimate. A precise six-figure amount for the January 6th build-out.
And build-out usually means things like stages, security, AV equipment, logistics. That suggests a pretty major commitment, doesn't it?
It implies a substantial role, yeah. Physically preparing for the event. And Kirk's response when asked to confirm receiving that invoice, it wasn't a denial, it wasn't an explanation. He just wrote back, yes.
So let me get this straight. First, a text. Nothing for Jan 6th. Then, just days later, confirmation of a nearly $250,000 invoice specifically for the January 6th build-out, paid by his organization, TPA.
That's the core contradiction the committee presented. You have the flat denial, then the confirmation of a massive financial commitment.
And when the committee tried to pin him down on this, on why these two things seemed totally at odds,
that's when he invoked the Fifth.
his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination.
Correct. The committee asked him directly, why did you say TPA wasn't involved in planning if you then confirmed this huge invoice? Did you recall issues with the budget? And maybe most crucially, did you believe President Trump incited the violence at the Capitol?
And his answer?
Fifth Amendment. Every single time. He declined to answer any of those substantive questions about his involvement, about the money, about his knowledge of the whole situation.
Legally, invoking the Fifth protects you. But politically, ethically, it leaves this huge question mark, right?
Yeah.
Especially with that kind of money involved.
A massive informational gap in the public record.
That's exactly right. The committee even noted they wouldn't officially close his deposition record because they needed to figure out the appropriate course of action.
So that critical question about his actual involvement, and that $211,931.33, it was just left hanging, unresolved, shielded by the Fifth Amendment.
Permanently unresolved, on the record.
Okay, so for everyone listening, think about this. You've got the initial denial, you've got this huge invoice confirming deep involvement, and then you've got the legal shield preventing any real explanation. How do you reconcile that? Given that testimony, do you believe Kirk's claim of non-involvement in Jan 6th efforts was truthfully addressed? Or was it avoided by invoking the Fifth Amendment? Just pause and think, right? 0 if you think it was truthfully addressed, or 1 if you think it was avoided. All right, let's shift gears now to the immediate aftermath of the assassination itself, because that's when the information fog really rolled in.
Instantly.
The basic facts we know. Kirk was shot once from a rooftop at Utah Valley University. Clearly a targeted attack. Right. And he was taken to the hospital by a private car, not an ambulance, and died there.
But before anyone really knew who the shooter was or why they did it, the political spin machine kicked into high gear.
Oh, immediately. President Trump addressed the nation really quickly after the news broke.
Yeah.
He didn't wait for police reports, didn't wait for the FBI.
What do you say?
He blamed, quote, the radical left group of lunatics for the killing. He called their rhetoric terrorism and hate speech. And he vowed his administration would, quote, get that problem solved.
So right out of the gate, the narrative was set. This was the left's fault, regardless of the actual facts, which nobody knew yet.
It's a powerful tactic, right? Frame the story before anyone else can. And it absolutely defined the national conversation in those first hours and days.
Authorities eventually identified the suspect.
They did. A couple of days later, Tyler Robinson was taken into custody. But by that point, the public square was just flooded with competing theories, conspiracy theories, really, all fueled by those existing political divides that Kirk himself had, worked so hard to widen.
Okay, let's break down those theories. Theory 1 seemed to focus almost immediately on a transgender connection.
Yeah, that one blew up really fast. It came out that the suspected shooter, Robinson, had a transgender partner. So conservative conspiracy theories just exploded online. They tried to directly link the murder back to Kirk's long history of very harsh anti-transgender rhetoric and his support for restrictive legislation.
The narrative being, this was direct retaliation for his political stance.
Exactly. It fit perfectly with the narrative Trump had already established. The radical left, or people associated with them, were responsible.
How did actual LGBTQ advocacy groups react to that speculation?
They pushed back hard. Someone from Rainbow, Utah, J.C. Thornton, was quoted criticizing it. They said people were really stretching to connect this to the trans community.
Especially since early reports hinted at more personal motives.
Right.
Mental health issues.
Right. Not necessarily a political act. The advocacy groups called the speculation very harmful and premature.
Okay, but then there was a second major theory. And this one was way more complicated because it pointed the finger inside the hard right movement. The Groyper speculation.
Yeah, this one requires a little unpacking of some pretty niche political groups.
Okay, the Groypers.
The Groyper movement. It's this loose network, mostly online, of ultra-right activists. Their main figurehead is Nick Fuentes.
And their relationship with Kirk wasn't friendly.
Not at all. They saw themselves as the real ideologues, the purists on the far right. And they often went after Kirk. They'd heckle him at his own Turning Point USA events.
Why? What was their beef with him?
They saw TPUSA as, sellouts. Too mainstream, too aligned with establishment Republican donors. They didn't like Kirk's focus on Israel or his efforts to include non-white conservatives. The Gropers are explicitly white nationalists.
So the speculation was that maybe this faction, seeing Kirk as too moderate or even a traitor, was behind the assassination.
That was the theory floating around, that this was basically infighting a civil war on the hard right.
Where did that specific idea even come from?
It supposedly came from an inscription. There were reports, never fully confirmed by law enforcement, mind you, of an inscription found on the bullets used in the attack.
And this inscription was linked to Groper slogans or ideology.
That was the rumor, yeah.
Yeah.
If that were true, it completely flips the script.
Yeah.
It means the attack came from within his own broad political camp, not from the left.
That's a huge conflict in the narrative. How did mainstream sources and the Groypers themselves respond to this?
Well, reliable outlets like Axios dismissed it pretty quickly as baseless. And Nick Fuentes himself, the Groyper leader, he publicly rejected it. He claimed his followers were being unfairly framed.
So what are we left with? Just confusion?
Pretty much. A real fog of information. You had the immediate political narrative. Blame the radical left. Then you had these other theories bubbling up. Internal Magus conflict or maybe personal retaliation linked to the trans partner. None were ever conclusively proven, but all of them were used to fuel the political mobilization happening after his death.
And what's really fascinating and maybe deeply disturbing is how that initial blame the left narrative from Trump clashes so dramatically with the actual historical data on political violence in the U.S.
This is a critical point, yeah. The statistical context just throws up a massive red flag against that immediate political framing.
Tell us about that data.
Okay, so sources show that if you look back over decades, cumulatively, homicides motivated by right-wing extremism have substantially outnumbered those motivated by left-wing extremism in the United States. It's not even close.
And the more recent data.
Yeah.
Just before this event.
It's even more stark. Absolutely stunning, actually. Let's just sit with these numbers for a second because they really cut through the rhetoric.
Okay.
The statistics covering the period from 2022 to 2024 are definitive on this point. Sources confirm that every single one of the 61 political killings recorded in the U.S. during that specific 2-year window, all 61, were committed by right-wing extremists.
All of them. 0 by left-wing extremists in that period.
0 recorded political killings attributed to left-wing extremists in that time frame. It was an entirely one-sided trend in terms of lethal political violence.
That completely contradicts the narrative being pushed after Kirk's death.
Completely. And counterterrorism experts also pointed out something else. They noted that Trump's previous pardons for people involved in the January 6th attack had created what they called a dangerous permission structure for political violence, basically signaling that such actions might not face severe consequences.
Regardless of the actual shooter's motive in Kirk's case, the broader context was already primed.
Exactly. So you have this immediate public story. The radical left is violent. But the documented history, especially the very recent past, shows overwhelmingly that lethal political violence was coming from the right. That fundamental contradiction is just hanging there.
Okay, let's move to the memorial service itself. This wasn't just a small church service. This was huge.
Oh, massive. State Farm Stadium in Arizona seats over 70,000 people. This was clearly designed to be more than just a memorial.
It felt like a blend of things.
Absolutely. Reporters on the scene described it as part evangelical revival, part massive political rally, religion and politics completely intertwined.
And Kirk was positioned
As a martyr. Multiple speakers explicitly called him a martyr for freedom, for faith. The event itself became this huge organizing opportunity.
How so? What were the tangible results?
The results were immediate and, frankly, staggering. Turning Point USA reportedly got 62,000 new student signups right afterward.
Wow.
Mega donors pledged millions more to fund the organization. This conservative youth factory, as The Guardian called it, got a massive injection of cash and recruits. And they were literally selling merchandise at the memorial, red hats that said, "Make America Charlie Kirk."
Filling hats at a memorial service.
Okay.
But amidst all that political energy, maybe the most talked about moment was Erica Kirk's speech, his widow.
Her address was incredibly poignant, and it presented this very clear message rooted deeply in her Christian faith. It stood in stark contrast to a lot of the other rhetoric that day.
What was her core message?
Forgiveness. She stood up there, vowed to continue his movement, but then declared that she forgave the alleged killer, Tyler Robinson.
That's a powerful statement in that context.
Immensely powerful. And she explained the theological basis for it. She talked about her marriage being an Ephesians 5 relationship.
Can you explain that reference?
Sure. For people not familiar, Ephesians 5 in the Bible lays out this very traditional, hierarchical view of marriage. The wife is often interpreted as having a role as a guardian, maybe more focused on the home and spirit, while the husband is the protector, the leader. Erica Kirk framed her forgiveness as fulfilling her Christian duty within that structure.
Aligning with Kirk's own mission, she said.
Right. She said it aligned with his mission to save the lost boys of the West, those consumed by anger, resentment, and hate. She publicly refused hate and revenge, explicitly aiming to overcome evil with good, which is a direct Christian teaching.
That's about as clear an expression of Christian nonviolence as you can get.
It really is.
But then, President Trump took the stage, and he was sitting right there during her speech.
Yeah, his presence alone just massively amplified the political dimension of the whole event. And what he said directly after her message of forgiveness, it was stunning.
What did he say?
He basically offered this very public rejection of that core principle she just laid out. He acknowledged that Charlie, believed in loving your enemies, but then Trump said, quote, "That's where I disagreed with Charlie. I hate my opponent and I don't want the best for them. I'm sorry. I am sorry, Erica."
He apologized to her while simultaneously rejecting the principle of forgiveness she just preached and declared he hates his opponents.
Directly. In front of tens of thousands in the stadium, millions watching live. It felt like a very strategic choice. Choose anger, choose division, reject grace as a political tool.
Mobilize the base through fury, not forgiveness.
That seemed to be the message. And it wasn't just Trump. That theme of political vengeance was echoed, maybe even amplified by others. Stephen Miller, the deputy chief of staff, gave a speech.
Miller's rhetoric is often pretty intense.
It was incredibly intense here. He didn't frame this as a spiritual debate or a political disagreement. He framed it as war, an existential military-style war against the progressive left.
Using that kind of language at a memorial.
Yes. He talked about the righteous fury ignited by Kirk's death, a fury their enemies couldn't comprehend, and then he explicitly vowed to use the power of the federal government to, quote, destroy progressive political organizations in Kirk's name.
Destroy.
His words were, "Identify, disrupt, dismantle, and destroy these networks." using language like dismantle and destroy military terms at a memorial service. It's clearly meant to justify extreme political action later on.
We also heard from others in the administration.
Yeah, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, was there, calling for investigations, even purges, within the military against anyone found to be critical of Kirk online.
So the whole event managed to fuse everything together. The money pouring in, the new recruits signing up, the declaration of martyrdom.
And this spiritual justification for political vengeance and institutional warfare.
It's kind of a political master stroke, in a way, but also the absolute core contradiction of the day.
Exactly. You have the widow offering Christian forgiveness, claiming the moral high ground of faith. And on the same stage, you have the political leaders harnessing raw anger, promising destruction.
Let them have it both ways.
It seems so. Claim the mantle of righteousness through Erica Kirk, while simultaneously firing up the base with Trump and Miller's message of fury. That dual narrative was incredibly effective at galvanizing the movement right at that moment.
Okay, let's pause on this. Think about the messages here. Erica Kirk's was clearly N on violence, N-O revenge. But the dominant political message from Trump, from Miller, the calls for action, that felt like, why? I hate my enemies. Why? We will destroy them. Considering the massive media coverage, the immediate political impact, which letter do you think best describes the overall sentiment that really dominated that memorial service? The message that reached the biggest audience? Just take a second, was it N or Y? All right, this leads us straight into the final section and maybe the most, cynical contradiction of this whole story. The free speech backlash.
Yeah, this part is something else.
Because the political movement Kirk championed, Turning Point USA, the broader AGA movement, they had spent years positioning themselves as the ultimate defenders of free speech.
Constantly railing against cancel culture, right? Saying universities were silencing conservative voices, that big tech was censoring them, uninhibited expression was their brand.
But then, immediately after Kirk's death, what happened?
They turned those exact same tactics, the ones they claimed to despise, against their own perceived opponents. It was swift, aggressive, and incredibly widespread.
How did it work? What form did this reverse cancel culture take?
It started as this huge public campaign, led by prominent Republican officials, conservative activists. The explicit goal was to get people fired or professionally disciplined for things they posted online.
Posts that did what?
Posts that maybe celebrated Kirk's assassination, which is obviously abhorrent, but also posts that were just seen as disparaging of his legacy, which is a much broader, much more subjective category.
So it wasn't just about condemning celebration of violence, it was about policing criticism too.
Absolutely. This wasn't just, online arguments. It became this coordinated effort to enforce political conformity in people's workplaces and the professional lives.
And it wasn't limited to one sector.
No, it cut across everything. The sources list numerous examples. Teachers in Texas, teachers in New York, disciplined or fired for critical comments. A U.S. Secret Service agent was investigated after writing that Kirk had spewed hate and racism.
A Secret Service agent?
Yep. A sports writer in Phoenix lost his job. Employees in international media outlets. A firefighter. The list goes on. And the political machinery kicked in hard.
Like Governor Abbott in Texas.
Exactly. Greg Abbott announced nearly 300 teachers in Texas alone were under investigation by the state for critical speech about Kirk, using state resources to track online comments.
And J.D. Vance.
Vice President J.D. Vance publicly called for a crackdown on what he called uncivil speech critical of Kirk. Defining what counts as uncivil suddenly became a government interest.
What did First Amendment lawyers and legal scholars make of all this?
They immediately pointed out the hypocrisy. I mean, it was glaring.
Oh.
Legal experts were quoted saying, look, these are the exact same people who were screaming about cancel culture and the dangers of regulating hate speech just a few years ago. Now they're leading the charge to get people fired for expressing views they don't like.
The New York Times had a term for this.
They did. They described it as morphing into a conservative version of the cancel culture. And they talked about the emergence of the woke right, a political group using the very social enforcement tactics they'd previously condemned.
And this campaign didn't just target ordinary people. It went after major media figures too, right?
Oh, yeah. The biggest example was probably Jimmy Kimmel.
Jimmy Kimmel Live.
Yeah.
Got suspended indefinitely.
Indefinitely suspended. It was a huge deal. It showed the reach and the power of this pressure campaign.
What would Kimmel do or say?
On his show, he criticized the right-wing response to the murder. He said something like, The Maggie gang was desperately trying to characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them.
So pointing out the potential Groyper connection or internal strife.
Basically questioning the immediate blame the left narrative. And that criticism was deemed completely unacceptable by Kirk's political allies. The reaction was swift and severe.
And it involved the federal government directly threatening the network.
That's what made it almost unprecedented. The FCC chief, Brendan Carr, publicly threatened action against ABC, the network that airs Kimmel.
What kind of action?
He talked about possibly revoking their broadcast licenses for the stations ABC owns directly.
Revoking broadcast licenses. That's like the nuclear option in media regulation, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Extremely rare. A massive threat to a network's entire business. So that political pressure from the FCC was immense, immediate, and ABC suspended the show indefinitely right after.
At the same time, you had government officials trying to legally redefine criticism as something punishable, like Pam Bondi.
Right. Attorney General Pam Bondi stated publicly her intent to target anti-Kirk speech, classifying it as hate speech.
But can the government just declare something hate speech like that? What are the legal issues?
That's where it gets incredibly dangerous constitutionally. Legal experts, like Professor Genevieve Laquire from the University of Chicago, pointed out there's simply no neutral definition of hate speech.
Meaning?
Meaning if you let the government define it, you risk letting them define political opposition as illegal. What one administration calls hate speech about a political figure, the next administration could use that precedent to silence speech they dislike. It's a slippery slope towards government censorship, basically, just dressed up as promoting civility.
Did any free speech groups weigh in on this? Groups that usually try to stay neutral?
They had to. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression Fire, they spoke out. They unequivocally condemned the assassination, called it despicable. But they also pointed out the profound irony. Conservatives who built their careers demanding free speech were now leading a campaign to silence critics. Fire challenged their supposed commitment to those principles.
So the sources really framed this whole backlash as a fight between two ideas.
Yeah. On one side, people saying political violence is always wrong and must be condemned, period. On the other side, people who seem to be using this specific tragedy to justify new measures, new powers, to silence their opponents and consolidate political control.
And the irony runs even deeper when you think about Kirk's own past actions, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Kirk's own organization, TPUSA, famously ran the Professor Watch List.
Right. Listing academics they deemed too liberal, trying to pressure universities.
Trying to get them fired for alleged leftist propaganda. So the very mechanism he helped pioneer using public pressure campaigns, watch lists to enforce ideological conformity was now being scaled up massively after his death. Applied to teachers, federal agents, journalists, firefighters, all using the tragedy as the justification.
It really shows how fast things can change, how quickly a principle like free speech can suddenly become conditional.
Free speech for me, but not for thee.
Yeah.
Especially if you criticize the designated martyr, that seemed to be the new rule.
And that really brings us full circle on the ambiguities and contradictions we set out to explore.
Yeah, we started by asking, was this story driven by grief or was it political strategy? And what we found is this narrative just riddled with internal conflicts.
Like the refusal to explain the money for January 6th.
Right. The immediate rush to blame the left for the assassination, even when the data on political violence pointed elsewhere.
That stark clash at the memorial between Erica Kirk's call for Christian forgiveness and the political leadership's call for righteous fury.
And then finally, deploying the very cancel culture tactics they'd supposedly fought against for years, using them to try and purge critics.
Why does digging into all this matter? Why should you, listening right now, care about these contradictions?
Well, this deep dive is crucial, I think, because it's a case study. It shows just how quickly a national tragedy can be taken, synthesized, and weaponized.
Weaponized to do what?
To dramatically redefine civil liberties. To redraw the lines of acceptable debate in America. And that shift, it doesn't just happen in Washington. It impacts your job, what you feel safe saying online, your basic freedom to disagree.
Okay, so here's that final provocative thought we promised you. Something to really chew on.
Charlie Kirk built his career advocating for the Second Amendment. He saw it as this essential tool for individual freedom, even if it meant accepting the cost of lives lost to gun violence.
Right.
Yet the political reaction to his death used that tragedy to argue for a massive expansion of government power, the power to investigate citizens, to pressure employers, to silence certain kinds of speech.
So the question for you to consider is this. Did the reaction to Charlie Kirk's death actually save free speech? Or did it demonstrate that maybe free speech is now just a concept, a weapon, used conditionally by whoever happens to hold power at the moment?
It's a tough question.
It really is.
Yeah.
We genuinely want to hear what you think. What's your most compelling thought after hearing all this? Pause right now. Seriously, just pause and write down one single word that sums up how this entire story makes you feel. Just one word.
Yeah, we'd love to see those.
And hey, if you appreciate these kinds of deep dives, getting past the headlines like we do here on KaiZen, please make sure you follow the show.
It really helps us keep doing this.
And share this deep dive with just one person,
Mm-hmm.
one friend, family member, whoever. Someone else who loves that rush of really getting informed.